The crisis in Ukraine ratcheted up several notches this week when NATO announced it's suspending all practical civilian and military cooperation with Russia because of its annexation of Crimea. Russia also stepped up economic pressure on Ukraine by hiking the price of natural gas by 44%. Meanwhile, there is continued concern about Russian troops on Ukraine's border. Many in the West question whether Russian President Vladimir Putin plans to take more of Ukraine or other former Soviet territories. NMIF producer Megan Kimrick sat down with Maria Oborotova. She is president of the Albuquerque International Association and a Russia native, to discuss what may happen next and what the West should do in response.
Marina, as president of the Albuquerque International Association and a native of Russia, I might add, you've been following the story very closely. So this crisis began when there were protests against a corrupt government in Ukraine. Eventually, the president, Viktor Yanukovych, was ousted because he had moved away from a pact with the European Union and back towards a trade agreement with Russia. Now, after he was forced out, he became Vladimir Putin's advisor on Ukrainian affairs. But I'm curious why this crisis was an opportunity for Vladimir Putin to annex Crimea.
Well, this crisis, what Ukraine experienced actually not one crisis. Ukraine experienced what I call an avalanche of crises. A very bad economic crisis that continues, political crisis, crisis of leadership, and on the top of all, it was an international crisis concerning Crimea. President Putin saw in the developments in Ukraine, in turmoil in Kiev and Ukraine, the threat to Russian interests and the interests of ethnic Russians. Was there any threat there? Well, there were insulting and discriminatory actions against Russians, that's for sure. And I can develop it later if you wish. That had to do with this law that was repealed by the government on the use of language in Ukraine.
Which previously, regions of Ukraine could make Russia the second official language, and that was repealed.
Not just Russian, not just Russian. In 2012, this law was adopted that allowed regions of Ukraine where local population, more than 10% of local population speaks other language than Ukrainian, to have this language as an official language too. Out of 27 regions of Ukraine opted for that, and it was not just Russian. Yes, it was Russian in the western part, in the eastern part of Ukraine, but it was Romanian and what else? Hungarian, I think, in the western parts of Ukraine. And so Parliament, so the new interim government, President Yanukovych fled on the 23rd of February, and so there was an interim government formed, the elections announced for the new president of Ukraine. And then next thing after that, the Parliament that was very much supportive of President Yanukovych in January especially, when they supported anti-repression law. They repealed it at the end of the month when they saw that protests are growing and growing. The same parliament that was supportive of Yanukovych started showing that they're very, very different. And so one of the first acts, they repealed that law, and that was a bad mistake. There is a very substantial Russian population, or ethnic Russians in Ukraine, so that was not a wise step to take.
It's not a wise step to take. So the fact that Vladimir Putin has made this a pretext for annexing Crimea, can we parse out how much danger or repression there was to ethnic Russians that preceded this, or is this really just a pretext? Or is the truth somewhere in between?
As I said, that there were discriminatory and insulting acts. We can add the demolition of monuments in Western Ukraine.
To heroes in World War II.
There were demolition of the statues of Lenin.
Yes.
That was not a big thing because that was happening after the Soviet Union collapsed all over. There were the demolition of monuments to Soviet soldiers that liberated Ukraine. That was insulting. And those Soviet soldiers were Ukrainian and Russian. And there were even demolition of monuments to Mikhail Kutuzov, who was a Russian hero who led Russian armies against Napoleon. So they definitely went too far, didn't know history very well. That was exciting. There was potential threat to Russian military presence in Crimea, but there was no physical threat or ethnic cleansing. Let me be very, very clear about that. So why Putin decided to take the stand on Crimea? For opportunistic and domestic reasons. That's why. I don't think that it was part of grand strategy, that it was planned way ahead. It's just the opportunity presented itself, and he acted. And so domestic reason was Putin was losing popularity in Russia since 2010. It was going down very substantially, and Russia also was in crisis. Economic crisis.
Yeah,
and so these two things bothered him very much. And let me tell you, he won big way. His popularity boosted. Now the latest numbers that I've seen are like 80% popularity as compared to 65 or even below before that crisis.
The NATO foreign minister today agreed to suspend all practical civilian and military cooperation with Russia. There's a divide right now, it seems, among Western powers. Should we isolate Russia? Should we put more sanctions on them? Should we try to engage? Should we keep talking? Do you have a sense of whether one of these is going to be more effective or whether the West should follow one or the other?
Well, I even haven't heard that. You know, the first thing that I checked in the morning, because today is the beginning of the second quarter, so what I checked on whether Russia changed prices on gas,
which
that
it
is
did.
going, which
It
it
hiked
did.
it more than
was,
40%.
Yes, and it was obvious that this is going to happen. I even haven't heard yet about NATO decision. So this is the question of what is to be done. What should West do in the face of this complicated situation? And let's start with Ukraine, because this crisis started in Ukraine, around Ukraine, and that needs to be taken care of. And it's very important to do that. I heard politicians saying that the most important thing in Ukraine is to have democratic elections. Excuse me, Ukraine had democratic elections in 2004 after the Orange Revolution, as well as in 2010 when the country elected the latest president, Yanukovych, quite democratically. So it's not the challenge. What Ukraine needs to have political reform, it needs to have parliamentary elections, it needs to have very substantial radical economic reforms. And there is no way Ukraine can do it on its own. Ukrainian economy is facing default. So the West, first of all, should help Ukraine to overcome the crisis. It's very difficult, and it will require a lot of money. 15 billion is just for starters, and it will take a very long time. And we do not even know whether it will succeed. It's the second try. It's the second try after Orange Revolution. You know, I want to make a very important point that what happened in Crimea in February, some people called it the February Revolution. It's not revolution so far, and I'm going to underline so far 3 times to make the point.
You mean in Ukraine? What
Yes,
happened in
because
Ukraine in February?
it will be the revolution if Ukraine proceeds with changing its economic and political system. And if it doesn't, it will be another failed revolution. And Ukraine can, and if it deals with corruption too, let me add this dimension, because the country—
It is highly corrupt,
One
based on
just-
international
Yes,
rankings.
ranks 144 among 177 countries of the world, according to Transparency International rankings.
So it needs help from the West economically,
So
clearly,
that's
but also
very substantial.
systemically in terms of its
Yeah,
political
absolutely
processes.
right. Like something like Marshall Plan for Ukraine that will not only give the money, but also helps to build institutions to make the country functional and strong, and only then it can become independent and neutral. So that will be very, very far ahead. So another thing you mentioned, whether, you know, what else? I think another very important thing is to reduce energy dependency of Ukraine from Russia. Ukraine is very heavily dependent, as well as of the European Union. I think these are very important measures that I will put even before all those other things. And it's easy to say that, but it's extremely difficult to do that. because of the pipes, because of Ukraine's historical dependence, because the European Union, 25% of energy supplies comes from Russia. In Germany, it's 30%. So it is very difficult to do. And there is, of course, second round of sanctions. Let's say Russia will, in order to stop Russia in terms of, crossing the borders of eastern Ukraine, and I think this is something that we need to talk about. So there's conversations about the second round of sanctions, but it's easier to say that than to do that. Those things cannot be done, changing of, reducing dependency. Germany a couple of years ago decided not to use nuclear energy, right? And so it is very complicated, and it will take a very long time. So in terms of engagement, that's what you said, engagement or isolation. Yes, there are two very general approach. One is to have political and economic isolation of Russia, another one, continuation of engagement. I do not think that the West and the United States has very good options in the short term. Why? Because, this policy of political and economic isolation, that will be pretty bad. That will be pretty bad.
You mean on Russia?
Yes, of course. Because, are we forgetting the lessons of after the First World War? What is the goal?
Germany?
Of course. What are we going to achieve of that? Do you want, Russia is already angry. Putin is angry. What do you want to achieve with that? You want to weaken Russia and make it angry, and weaken angry power with nuclear weapons? What are we talking about? Humiliation and whatnot? It's not the best approach, in my personal opinion. The policy of engagement also didn't work quite well. Yes, there were areas where the United States collaborated with Russia, fight against terrorism, Iran, to a certain amount Syria, American planes flying over Russian territory, going to Afghanistan, but it didn't work in other areas. And so we cannot say that the policy of engagement is perfect, but I think that it's lesser evil than economic and political isolation of Russia. So the choice is not between good policy and bad policy, being strong or being weak. It is the choice between two evils and the choice for the lesser evil. But in the long term, the United States, of course, should formulate strong, sound policy towards Russia. I haven't seen strong policy or sound policy towards Russia since the 1990s. Russia was always somewhere like an afterthought after fight against terrorism, and then Middle East, and then pivot to Asia. And so it was ignored, definitely. There should have been more attention paid to Russia.
We are out of time, and I apologize because I know this is very complicated. But if you will stay a little longer, we'll do a little extra on the web.
Absolutely. And if our listeners want to have the in-depth analysis of going to Ukraine and around Ukraine, I think they just need to come to the Albuquerque International Association lectures. So we do the in-depth coverage, and so this is to be continued. Just come to the Albuquerque International Association events.
All right. Thank you so much, Marina.
Thank you too.